People call me a crazy old man guarding a rundown shack, but they have no idea I'm watching over a $9 million treasure right beneath their feet. A man I once tried to accept as my grandson-in-law Brandon thought he had won when he stripped everything away from my granddaughter. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a snack, get comfortable, and settle in for a long story, because this is a tense game of chess I think you'll enjoy. Leave a comment wherever you're watching so I know how far this story travels, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see how this match finally ends. The story begins in 1974, back when this town didn't have smooth asphalt roads, and Hawkins Lake was just a dark patch of water hidden behind old-growth forests. At the time, I worked the night shift at the local paper mill. My job was to stand beside enormous grinders where massive logs were crushed into fine white pulp. That's where I learned a hard lesson. The more fragile something is, the easier it tears, but anything truly valuable is forged under tremendous pressure. I saved every dollar I could. While my coworkers spent their paychecks on after-shift beers or shiny pickup trucks, I tucked my modest wages into an old iron box. I counted every bill carefully, each one flat and smelling faintly of sweat. That fall, I bought my first cabin. It was barely more than a skeleton of a house with rotting cedar planks and a sagging frame. I still remember the first time I stood on the porch and looked out across the lake. The wind came in off the water, carrying the clean scent of wet earth and cold fresh water. My wife Margaret looked at me with doubt in her eyes, but I simply squeezed her hand. That was the beginning of the work. I would spend the next 50 years doing maintenance. I bought cedar wood stain, the best kind I could afford, with my carefully saved money. Patiently, I brushed it on layer after layer over those dry, cracked boards. Watching the resin soak into the grain of the wood felt a lot like the way I poured my faith into that piece of land. I learned something important back then. If you take care of wood, it will shelter you from the storm. Land works the same way. In 1978, the first turning point appeared. Old farmer Miller, who owned 40 acres bordering my cabin, ran into trouble. His wife needed urgent heart surgery, and the bank didn't have much patience for an aging farmer. I went to see him late one afternoon when the sun was nothing more than a bruised red streak across the lake. I brought the iron box with me. I didn't bargain. I handed him exactly the amount he needed, not a dollar less. It was the money I had planned to use to renovate the kitchen for Margaret. When old Miller signed the transfer papers with trembling hands, I knew I had just made a vow to myself. Why was I so obsessed with land? Because in the paper mill I watched people come and go, contracts torn apart, promises washed away by shifting money. But land was different. Land doesn't lie. It doesn't promise overnight wealth, but it has never abandoned the one who cares for it. If you stand on land that belongs to you, no one has the right to tell you where to go or what to do. By 1980, I owned another 20 acres on the south side of the lake. That was when I began making myself a cup of hot chocolate every early morning, the one luxury I ever allowed myself. The bitterness of cocoa mixed with the sweetness of condensed milk, and the warmth rising from that old ceramic mug, kept me clear-headed enough to see further ahead. I started drawing, not paintings maps. I sketched boundary lines and marked the parcels I intended to buy next. Every acre I added was like another layer of armor wrapped around my family. I was careful, calculating. I saved every spare coin from recycling scrap wood at the mill. People laughed and called me Arthur the Miser. I just smiled. They saw an old man with paint-stained clothes. I saw a fortress slowly taking shape. The grinding machines at the paper mill gradually faded from my life as retirement approached, but the habit of careful planning had already seeped deep into my bones. By the 2000s, Hawkins Lake was no longer my private secret. Land prices began creeping upward. Men in suits from the city started driving shiny SUVs along the lakeside road, holding maps in their hands and greed shining in their eyes. But the most dangerous predators weren't strangers. They were sitting right at my family's dinner table. My daughter Ruth and her cousin always looked at the 243 acres surrounding the lake as if it were a winning lottery ticket that I was selfishly hoarding. Whenever they came to visit, I made hot chocolate. The steam rose from the mug, and the bitter taste of pure cocoa sliding down my throat helped me stay calm enough not to say the harsh words sitting on the tip of my tongue. They talked about maximizing profits, about building an eco-resort. I just looked down at my hands, my fingernails still stained with dark cedar paint. Then Claire grew up. My granddaughter, the child with eyes as clear as the lake in summer. I watched her run across the green fields I had protected with a lifetime of brutal night shifts at the paper mill. And I knew something then. She was the only reason this fortress existed. But eventually, the real wolf appeared. Brandon. The first time Claire brought him to meet me, I was sitting on the porch carefully repainting an old cedar chair. He stepped out of the car in a perfectly pressed suit, wearing a smile so flawless it looked like it had been molded in a factory. He shook my hand. It wasn't the handshake of respect. It was the handshake of a man measuring his opponent's strength. And in that moment, I saw it. A flash in his eyes when he looked across the stretch of lakefront land that belonged to me. He didn't see Claire as a woman to love. He saw a glowing balance sheet. If you can already feel the trouble coming, my friend, drop a like and subscribe. That kind of support is the only thing keeping this channel alive. Stay with me because the real story is about to begin. I didn't buy land to become rich. I bought it to prepare for a divorce that would happen 30 years later. That thought crossed my mind like a prophecy. Brandon was clever. He praised my persistence. He asked about the boundaries of the properties with a kind of polite curiosity that looked genuine on the surface. He thought I was just a senile old man clinging to the past. But he didn't understand something. A paper mill worker can tell the difference between real paper and diluted pulp with a single touch. Brandon was exactly that kind of diluted pulp, polished and impressive on the outside, but the kind that falls apart the moment a storm hits. The greatest pain for me wasn't watching him deceive Claire. It was knowing that I couldn't interfere too early. I had seen the way Claire looked at him with pure admiration. If I had driven him away at that moment, I would have become the villain in my granddaughter's eyes, and she would never learn how to recognize predators on her own. So I stood there and watched her fall in love with a man I knew would betray her. Do you know what it feels like to watch a young tree being hollowed out by insects from the inside, but you can't spray pesticide because the tree must learn to produce its own resin to survive? It's a quiet form of torture. Night after night I sat at my drafting table in my study. The dim yellow lamp cast long shadows across stacks of sketches. I wasn't drawing landscapes. I began sketching the structure of the Hawkins Land Trust. In 2005, I secretly established that trust. I divided the 243 acres into a maze of legal fragments so complicated that even the sharpest attorneys would struggle to untangle them. I hid my name. I hid Claire's name. I turned the land into something legally invisible. And I did all of it in absolute silence, surrounded by the smell of cedar stain and the bitter warmth of hot chocolate every night. The more I watched Brandon manipulate Ruth and slowly begin controlling Claire's decisions, the tighter my chest felt. There were moments when I wanted to grab Claire by the shoulders and shout, "He's lying to you, he only wants this land." But then I would look down at the painting in front of me, a calm lake just moments before a storm breaks. And I would remind myself I had to be patient. A man who waited 50 years to buy land can wait a few more years to carry out a reckoning. If you were in my place, would you shout, "He's deceiving you"? Or would you let her learn the lesson herself? Tell me what you think in the comments below. Those were the loneliest years of my life. I played the role of a grumpy old man who cared about nothing but hammering nails and repainting cedar boards. I watched Brandon marry Claire. I watched him slowly reveal his nature when he began borrowing money from Ruth for investments. And I watched the light in Claire's eyes begin to change admiration, slowly replaced by worry. The fortress was already built. The legal cannons were loaded. All I needed now was a spark from the other side. And Brandon, the arrogant hunter, had no idea that he was the one walking into a trap. A trap that had been prepared long before he ever appeared in our lives. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room had never sounded so heavy. By 2016, my body began to protest. The hands that had hardened beside paper grinders now ached whenever the weather shifted. But my mind was sharper than ever. I could sense it. The beast was growing impatient. Brandon was no longer satisfied with playing the charming son-in-law. Now he wanted true ownership. One late evening as I sat on the porch, absent-mindedly turning a mug of now cold hot chocolate in my hands, I saw Brandon and Ruth whispering beneath the cedar tree in the distance. Brandon's eyes weren't on his mother-in-law. They were fixed on the boundary line where my land met the lake. He pointed toward it, his face carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed victory was already in his pocket. A chill ran down my spine. It was the instinct of a man who had spent half a century guarding land. Brandon had begun working on Ruth, the soft-hearted woman who had always dreamed of a more luxurious life. He was convincing her that this old man had grown too senile to manage such a massive estate. My chest tightened when I thought of Claire. She was pregnant. The happiness in her eyes sparkled so brightly that it almost hurt to look at. She had no idea that the husband she loved was quietly plotting to turn her family's legacy into lifeless blocks of concrete. I wanted to run to her, hold her, and whisper, "Run, child. Run while you still can." But I couldn't. If I shattered that fragile bubble of happiness now, Brandon would play the victim and I would become the bitter old man destroying his granddaughter's home. So I chose a lonelier path. Protocol B. Brandon thought he had already won when he started stripping everything away from my granddaughter. What he didn't know was that I had already hired 3 of the best lawyers just to wait for the moment he stepped into the trap. I drove my old pickup truck into the city and met Thomas Wilder in a sealed conference room with no windows. Thomas was the only man who understood my language, not the language of promises, but the language of legal clauses tightened as firmly as cedar fibers pressed under thousands of tons of pressure. Arthur Thomas said quietly as he studied the diagram of the 243 acres, "You're building a legal labyrinth. If Brandon touches this, he'll lose everything." I nodded, my hand slowly tightening into a fist. "I don't want him to lose everything," I said. "I want him to believe he's already won, so that his own greed will tighten the noose around his neck." Then I looked Thomas straight in the eyes. "Activate Protocol B when I'm gone." Protocol B wasn't just a stack of documents. It was a layered shield. It stated that every acre within the Hawkins Land Trust could never be sold. The land could only be leased long-term under strict conditions that only the holder of the copper key could authorize. And that key I would not hand to Claire while she was still vulnerable. I returned to the cabin and began my final preparations. For hours I repainted the exterior of the house. The smell of cedar stain filled the air, sharp but clean, seeping deep into my lungs. Every brushstroke felt like a quiet prayer for Claire's strength, because I knew something painful was inevitable. Claire would have to fall first. She would have to taste the bitterness of betrayal from the man she loved. She would have to see the true faces of her mother and uncle. Only then would she become strong enough to command this land. A tree can only drive its roots deep when it survives the fiercest storms. In 2018, I watched Brandon secretly bring home forged contracts, coaxing Ruth into signing authorization papers. I saw everything through the narrow crack of my study door. My heart pounded violently. My hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped my mug of hot chocolate. It's a special kind of agony when a guardian must watch an enemy enter his own house, yet isn't allowed to fire the first shot. Some nights I sat in the dark and sketched, but the blueprint of Protocol B wasn't on paper anymore. It existed in the architecture of patience. In my mind I painted a different picture, a figure standing on a hill looking down over a valley that had just burned. That figure was Claire of the future, a woman who would rise from the ashes of a shattered marriage and claim the kingdom her grandfather had protected with his entire life. I began writing letters. Each one was a fragment of the truth. I hid them in places that only the soul of someone who truly loved the land would think to search. My silence during those years was like a frozen lake, calm and cold on the surface, but beneath it a powerful current was gathering, waiting for the day the ice would finally break. Do you believe in long-term vision? Comment patience if you're building something for the future, and subscribe if you want to see how I protected mine. By the end of 2019, I knew my time was running out. The lingering cough and the slow weakening of my bones were signs that I would soon have to leave my post as the guardian of this place. But I wasn't afraid. Protocol B was complete. The Hawkins Land Trust had been legally sealed. Brandon smiled with growing confidence every time he saw me grow weaker. In his mind, my death would be the moment he finally gained control of the land. What he didn't know was this: my death would be the trigger that began his nightmare. I looked at Claire as she stood by the lake holding her small child in her arms. A quiet smile crossed my face. "My dear girl," I thought, "I'm sorry I had to let you suffer. But I promise you this, when the storm finally passes, you will be the most powerful woman on this land. No man will ever take that away from you again." The winter of 2020 arrived earlier than expected, bringing a bone-deep cold that slipped through the cedar branches around the cabin. I knew it would be my last winter. My body felt light and dry now, like an old piece of firewood ready to crumble, but my eyes still burned with unwavering certainty, because I still had one final task to complete before my breath disappeared into the frozen air of Hawkins Lake. My study was filled with the scent of pine oil and the sharp tang of paint. I sat before the easel, my hand trembling around the brush, yet my mind was strangely calm. This was painting number 10, the most important painting in the life of a paper mill worker who had somehow become a guardian of land. I painted the coldest night of my life. The night when snow covered all 243 acres, hiding every trace of the schemes and hopes buried within that land. I painted the frozen lake in a dull gray blue. But beneath the ice, with thin and careful strokes, I hinted at the current still moving underneath. That was my legacy. From the outside, people would see only something still and lifeless. But beneath it lay power waiting for the moment to break free. Before the paint had even dried, I took a thick manila envelope, the one containing the entire soul of Protocol B, and carefully hid it behind the frame. There was a secret compartment there, one I had carved myself out of cedar wood the year before. I still remember the taste of the hot chocolate that night. It was more bitter than usual. I sipped it slowly, letting the last warmth seep into my failing chest. Brandon stopped by the next morning. He no longer pretended to be polite. He stood in the doorway and looked at me the way someone looks at a product nearing its expiration date. "Grandpa, you should rest," he said, his tone dripping with false kindness. "Let Mom and me handle the land matters." I looked at him and gave a quiet, mysterious smile. He thought I was senile. What he didn't know was that inside my coat pocket rested the copper key, the only key capable of unlocking the legal labyrinth he was about to walk straight into. He saw a dying old man. I saw a man about to dig his own grave with his greed. Brandon believed he had already won by stripping everything away from my granddaughter. What he didn't know was that I had hired 3 of the best lawyers simply to wait for the moment he stepped into the trap. During those days I watched Claire from a distance. She looked exhausted, her eyes heavy with pain, as she slowly began to see Brandon's coldness for what it really was. My heart ached. More than once I nearly called her over, ready to place the copper key in her hand and say, "End this now." But then I remembered the lesson from the paper mill. Wood that has never been tempered will rot easily. Claire had to endure this pain. Only then could she become steel. I spent my final clear hours writing a letter to her. Each word appeared slowly on the sheet of handmade paper, the kind I had carefully selected myself. "My dear Claire, land does not lie, and neither does pain. When you read these words, your world may have already fallen apart. But remember, this beneath your feet, I have built a fortress that no man and no lie can ever break through." I placed the letter and the copper key inside a small wooden box and hid it beneath the 3rd floorboard from the fireplace, a place Claire would only search when she felt truly alone and desperate for warmth. On my last night, I lay in bed listening to the snow falling softly on the roof. The faint smell of freshly painted cedar drifted through the room, gently carrying me toward my final sleep. I wasn't afraid of death. I felt peace knowing the seed I had planted over 50 years had already begun to grow. When the storm came, when Brandon finally brought out his forged contracts, that would be the moment Protocol B activated on its own. People looked at my life and saw a man who saved every penny. A stubborn old fool clinging to forgotten acres of land. They saw dryness and stubbornness. But they never saw the burning love I carried for this family. A legacy is not numbers written on paper. A legacy is the quiet protection you give to someone you love. Legacy is not money. Legacy is protection. If my story changes the way you think about the value of family, share it and subscribe if you want to hear the secrets that follow. I closed my eyes and pictured Claire standing on the porch, the copper key in her hand, looking across Hawkins Lake, glowing under the light of a spring morning. She would no longer be a victim. She would be the owner. My body now rests beneath the oldest cedar tree near the lake, but sometimes I feel as if my spirit still lingers in the morning mist, settling quietly on my granddaughter's shoulder when she steps onto the porch with a broken heart. This is the final chapter of a plan that took half a century to build. The moment when the patience of an old paper mill worker stands face to face with the greed of a predator. I watched everything from the void. Brandon stood there with the triumphant look of a man who believed he had just conquered a kingdom. He tossed eviction notices onto the wooden table I had spent years polishing with my own hands. He talked about selling the 243 acres to a luxury resort corporation. He talked about moving Claire to some unfamiliar apartment in the city. He believed my death had erased the final obstacle. What he didn't know was that Arthur had prepared for this moment since 1983. Then it happened. In the depths of her despair, Claire accidentally dropped the 10th painting. The frame shattered on the floor, and the manila envelope slipped free along with the copper key. When she read the final words I had written to her, I saw something change in her eyes. The weakness was gone. The resignation was gone. In its place burned a cold, sharp fire. Brandon stepped forward, trying to snatch the envelope from her hands, but Claire stood up straight. For the first time, she didn't look at him with love. She looked at him with the contempt reserved for an intruder. "This isn't your land," Claire said, her voice sharp like cedar struck with a hammer. "This is the Hawkins Land Trust, and you just activated Protocol B." The reversal happened so quickly, Brandon barely had time to react. Under the terms of Protocol B, any illegal attempt to transfer the land by someone who wasn't the rightful beneficiary automatically froze the entire estate. Control would then shift to an independent trust authority, one that only Claire had the legal right to command. Brandon had already signed forged agreements with Ruth. And those signatures, they were now confessions of fraud. If you've followed this story all the way to this moment, do us one quick favor: subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing and means a lot to us. I watched Brandon's face turn pale when Thomas Wilder stepped into the house carrying a thick stack of legal documents. The hunter had finally become the prey, and the legal trap I had spent decades building had just snapped shut. But what made me proudest wasn't watching Brandon walk away with nothing. It was something else. When a real estate corporation offered double the market price to buy the land and build a luxury resort, Claire shook her head. She looked out across the lake, the same place where we used to sit together and fish, and said quietly, "Land is power. We won't sell. We can lease small sections for sustainable development, but the roots of this land must belong to the Hawkins family." That's right, my girl. You finally understood the philosophy: land is power. Money can disappear, but land gives you a place to stand in a world that never stops shifting. A legacy is not money. A legacy is protection. If this story has changed the way you think about family and what truly matters, share it and subscribe if you want to hear the next secrets. Before I fade completely from this world, there are 3 things I want to leave behind. Patience is the ultimate weapon. Never rush to harvest when the seed has only just begun to sprout. A plan meant to protect your family must be measured in decades, not days. Be patient, like cedar wood. It grows slowly, but once it stands tall, nothing can shake it. Don't be afraid to watch your loved ones struggle. Sometimes the greatest form of love is not preventing pain, but building a fortress they can return to after learning their own lessons. Claire is strong today because of the tears she once shed. The value of silence. Never reveal all your cards. Let your opponent believe they are winning. That is when they expose their greatest weaknesses. My silence was never weakness. It was the quiet observation of an old hunter. Life is a lot like making a cup of hot chocolate. You need the bitterness of truth and the heat of hardship before you can truly taste the sweetness of victory. And I hope that whenever Claire stands on this land, she remembers that once there was a crazy old man who shed sweat and a little blood to make sure that land would never be stained by greed. My legacy is complete. Now I'll ask you something. What kind of fortress are you building for the people you love? If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting like and subscribe to hear more raw, real stories about family loyalty and justice. And as always, thank you for being part of this space.